It's fucking great. I do things like this. Is that easy enough? I'm Michael. I come from Bournemouth on the south coast of England. I studied just along in Edinburgh. But yeah, my job takes me around universities all over Europe. I'm explaining something of the heart of the Christian message, but also dealing with some of the big questions and objections that people have. And that's one of the ones that we're going to look at today. So, welcome, especially if you've not been to one of these before. As we said, we've got questions coming up in about 20 minutes' time. So please do ask your questions. We won't be offended if you disagree with me. We won't be offended if you want to say that you think I didn't do a good job or whatever. Please tell us why. Please either text in or by all means put your hand up at the end, and we'll go through for as much as we can and deal with as many of those questions. So please don't feel that I'm going to be upset if you do that. I'm very upset if you don't. Okay? And so that's where we're going. The number's up on the screen so you can look as we go through. And we're looking at this question of religion and violence, basically. Why do the followers of God, those who claim to follow God, often through history and often around the world today, still cause so much harm and violence? So just listen to someone like Gore Vidal, the American author. He says, more people have been killed in the name of Jesus Christ than anyone else in history. Or Christopher Hitchens, who died just a year ago, saying, religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. Or maybe slightly longer ago, Oscar Wilde said, when I think of the harm the Bible has done, I despair of ever writing anything to equal it. Basically, religion, violence, it just goes together. But not just religion in general, often the attack quite specifically at the Bible and at Jesus in particular. And then more recently, Richard Dawkins, in The God Delusion, published 10 years ago now, starts off in his introduction very evocatively and provocatively this way by saying, imagine with John Lennon a world with no religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, no gunpowder plots, no Indian partition, no Israeli-Palestinian wars, no Serb-Croat Muslim massacres, no persecution of Jews as Christ killers, no shiny bouffant-haired televangelists fleecing gullible people out of their money because God wants you to give till it hurts. Imagine no Taliban to blow up ancient statues, no public beheadings of blasphemers, no flogging of female skin for the crime of showing an inch of it. Imagine a world with no religion. And his answer is a world with no religion, he suggests, would be a world that would be a lot better. That religion, in the name of one of his television series, is the root of all evil. Now, it's not just a modern issue. If you go back to the mathematician Pascal, he said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. And he's been around for a few years. Well, he was around a few years ago, I should say. But I guess one of the things that really brought it home for many of us was the attacks on 9/11 and the realisation that religious beliefs and fundamental religious convictions can lead to real violence in the Western world, not in just distant shores. And so it raises real big questions, doesn't it? Does religion cause violence? Would getting rid of religion be a solution to the world's problems? Just by way of introduction, I think just three things worth saying at the start. Firstly, I want to question, is religion the root of all evil? That's what Richard Dawkins suggested in the Channel 4 series that he did just after the release of his book. Certainly religion has been the cause of evil in the world. I wouldn't want to deny that whatsoever. But it hasn't been the only cause by any means. I remember when I was a kid studying maths growing up in Leicester, my maths teacher overheard me talking about Christianity one day, and he said, most of the wars in the world are caused by religion. I'm having nothing to do with it. And because I was a rather annoying 14-year-old boy, I turned around and said, and lots of wars are caused by money, sir. I presume you're having nothing to do with that either. It didn't work very well, I just got a detention. But religion isn't the only cause of evil, is it? I do a lot of work in Romania, my girlfriend lives there. And those that are older than about 20 years will remember well a lot of the violence that was meted out on religious people by those who were claiming to be atheists because of their religious beliefs. So it could work both ways. Another problem that we might have is that we can fail to differentiate between religious beliefs. It's so often kind of put forward by the new atheists, inverted commas, that all religion is equally dangerous. That's not necessarily true, is it? I mean, I guess most of us don't lie awake at night worrying about the Amish and whether they're going to blow up bombs or on buses or stuff like that. I mean, religions are different, aren't they? And then it's worth asking, what is religion anyway? How do we define religion? Well, I wonder how you would do it. Is religion belief in God? Well, that would rule out some religions because they don't all believe in God. What is religion? So the reality is, anything could be classed as a religion in one sense, although I wouldn't always be given that word, because everybody has a belief system, a philosophy, a worldview, a way of looking at the world, making sense of the world. Everybody can. And every philosophy and belief system, whether we class it as a religious one or not, can be open to abuse and can lead potentially to violence and be used that way, and has been. And so when we ask the question of what is religion, I think it's a very important one, because every philosophy could be used that way. So rather than saying religion is dangerous, or philosophies are dangerous, because everybody has some belief, even if we believe that there is no God, we all have beliefs about the world. Rather than saying belief is dangerous, we need to ask, when people do evil things, cause violence and conflict and harm, are their actions a logical, consistent outworking of their beliefs, or quite the opposite, an inconsistency with what they claim to believe? That's why you can't just put all the religions together. We need to say, when people who do certain things, is that consistent? Is that a good reflection of what they claim to believe and who they claim to follow? It's a question of consistency that's important. Let me try and illustrate. I don't know if you like the band Queen, okay? Bohemian Rhapsody and all that. Good for karaoke. But Queen, okay? Fairly alright band. Now imagine if some of the members of the Christian Union next week, after the Uncover week is finished, decide amongst themselves that they would like to form a Queen tribute band. There are a few around, so here they are. And imagine if Andrew and Innes and a few of the members of the group decide, we've got nothing to do with our time now, we've done events week, let's form a tribute band. So they get together. Now you need to know something about these guys. They're not particularly musical. I mean, Innes goes to a free church and he's quite good with a tuning fork, but they're not necessarily the guys that you would expect to form a Queen tribute band. So they get together, they have a practice for about half an hour, and then they advertise that they're going to be putting on a gig in Kudos up at the QM next Wednesday. Okay? Now, most of us who know Innes and Andrew and know of the band Queen would know that Kudos next Wednesday would probably be the last place in Glasgow that you'd want to frequent, okay? Anywhere but Kudos. Andrew's shaking his head vehemently at this, but I can say that would probably be a good idea to avoid it. But next week there just happens to be a group of Mongolian students on placements in the University of Glasgow, and they come on their horses or whatever, and they're walking through the QM on Wednesday morning, and they see this poster and it says Queen Tribute Band tonight, 7 o'clock Kudos. And they think, ooh, Queen, never heard of Queen, must be a musical kind of group. Let's go along and see what we think. So on Wednesday nights, along come the Mongolian students, and up get Andrew and Innes and their friends to play. And needless to say, it's not a pretty sight, or even less a prettier sound, we should say. And within about 10 minutes, the Mongolian students are seen running as fast as they can away from the Union, saying to themselves, Queen are the worst band who have ever lived. They are awful, we hate their music. Now, have they reached a correct conclusion? Well, in one sense, yes. Their experience of Queen, the representation that they've seen, has been a very bad one. You wouldn't blame them, would you, for not wanting to check out Queen any further. But actually they've had a bad representation of a group that you might or might not think are actually quite good. Now what's to say with all this Mongolian student business is this. When we look at Christians through history, those who claim to follow Christ, it is sad to say that there have been many Christians through history that have been bad representatives of Jesus Christ. People who have claimed to follow Jesus who have claimed the name of Jesus, but have actually lived, I would say, quite inconsistently, who have been bad representatives of the Jesus that they claim to follow. But we can't just paper over the fact that it has happened. You have things like the Crusades, where people thought they were being faithful to Jesus and reclaiming his kingdom by going to war against Muslims and trying to win back the Holy Land. But actually, I would suggest if they had studied the Bible and looked at the person of Jesus, they would have realised that that was inconsistent with the Jesus that they were claiming to follow. Jesus had actually spelt out quite clearly that his kingdom was not a political kingdom. In fact, it's kind of ironic that Jesus was put on trial for the very claim that he was bringing political instability. And at his trial, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were so, my followers would have fought with swords." But actually, Jesus tells his followers to put away their swords, because his kingdom is not a political kingdom. Elsewhere, Jesus was talking to a woman from a different religious background, and she was asking Jesus, well, where should we worship? The Jews worship in this place, we worship in this place, they go to that temple, we go to this temple. What does Jesus say? He says true worshippers don't worship in a temple built of bricks. They don't go to a certain building or a certain geographical place. They come to a person. Jesus says true religion, true Christianity is not about a place, but a person. It's about knowing God through Christ. Now, you don't need to reclaim the Holy Land. You don't need a certain building to know God. You come through a person. And so sadly, through history, people have misunderstood that. They thought it is about buildings, about places, about certain lands, and about building a political kingdom. Actually, one of the saddest things I think that happened in the history of Christendom was the close alignment between the state and the Roman Empire and the church, where true Christianity and understanding of Jesus was often lost. But it's worth saying there have been bad representatives through history, people who haven't represented Jesus, I think, well at all. And I can't get away from that. But let's go back to our Mongolian students for a second, okay? We've just left them running down the road outside, convinced that Queen are the worst band in the world. Now, what could you do if you wanted to help them in their quest for musical excellence? Well, you could say to them, hey, you've had a pretty bad experience, guys. If you'd have known that Innes and Andrew were not the best guys to represent Queen. But there just so happens to be another Queen tribute band who are a whole lot better, and they're playing on the other side of town. I'll take you to go and hear them. And they go, and of course they don't hear Queen, but they probably hear something much closer to the original, much more consistent with what was originally recorded. And again, if you look through history, you can also see people who have claimed the name of Jesus, who I would say have been more consistent with the Jesus that they claim to follow. People who have consistently sought to work out what it is to follow Jesus in their lives, in their relationships, but also in society as a whole. One of the tragedies is often we neglect to see this. Often we completely ignore the fact that Christianity can ever do any good in history, but it has done. I mean, just look at someone like William Wilberforce 300 years ago, who stood against slavery, so 200 years ago, and fought for the abolition of that from his Christian conviction that created in the image of God, people had dignity and value, whatever the colour of their skin. It was his Christian convictions that led him to do that. Or Martin Luther King, who stood against the institutionalised racism in the United States, because again, his conviction that whatever the colour of someone's skin, they are valuable in God's eyes. See, they're good representatives, people who sought to follow consistently Jesus Christ's teaching. And there's a whole legacy of that in our country that often we neglect to see. And the very fact of free education, many of our schools and the whole system of free schooling was a Christian initiative influenced by Christians. A lot of our hospitals were opened and founded by Christians. That's why many hospitals are called Saint something or other, because of the Christian influence behind them. The abolition of slavery in Great Britain was driven by Christians. Much of the modern study of science came out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. There is so much good in so many fields that have been and has been influenced by Christians. And one of the tragedies is, if you read someone like Dawkins or Hitchens, they seem blind to this fact. There's a complete failure to recognise any of this. Now, I'm acknowledging that sometimes in the name of Christianity people have not done this. But we also, for fairness, need to acknowledge that sometimes this has happened as well. But I don't want to be too unfair on all atheists, because not all atheists are the same. Matthew Paris, I mentioned him yesterday, is an atheist, a columnist for the Times newspaper. And he wrote this in a very interesting column a couple of years ago. Not what you'd expect him to write. He says, now a confirmed atheist, I have become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. I used to avoid this truth by applauding, as you can, the practical work of mission churches in Africa. Practical churches and mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that salvation is part of the package. But Christians, black and white, working in Africa, do heal the sick, do teach people to read and write, and only the severest kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or school and say the world will be better without it. And I have to really applaud Matthew Paris for his honesty there. Of course, the question I'd love to ask is, if you can see the good that it could do in Africa, possibly could you see the good it could also do in Britain as well, and the good that it has done? See, there have been good representatives through history, those who've sought to follow Jesus and live out his teaching, and we'd be blind to ignore that. But let's, for the last time, just go back to our Mongolian student, shall we? How could you help these guys really know what Queen are like? They've heard a very bad representation. You could take them to hear a decent tribute band and they can hear a good representation. But of course the best thing you could do is you could buy them a CD or an MP3 if they've got an iPod. And you can say, listen to the real thing. Check it out for yourself. And then make up your minds. And I would say, if we're going to make up our mind on Christianity, don't just look at the bad representatives of Christ through history. Don't just look at the good representatives of Christ through history, but look at the real thing. Actually take a look at Jesus for yourself and make up your mind on him. What would it be like to follow him? And what would following him look like in terms of my life and relationships? Because one of the things I find amazing about Jesus is when you look at him, you see just how opposed to religious violence and conflict he is. So you get to a situation where Jesus is walking through Samaria, a different religious and ethnic group to him, and these people reject Jesus and his message. And some of Jesus' hot-headed disciples say to Jesus, hey Jesus, shall we call down some thunderbolts from heaven and destroy them? Let's smite them, Jesus. They don't agree with you. Let's get rid of them. And Jesus doesn't applaud them, but he condemns that attitude. He says they don't understand what he's come for and what he's about. That's not the way you treat your enemies. In fact, he taught in the Sermon on the Mount that you love your enemies, you do good to those who persecute you. Now you might say, that's all very well and good. It's one thing to teach it, it's another thing to live it. But actually here again you see Jesus the one who utterly and consistently lives out that teaching. See Jesus being arrested for no crime that he's ever committed. And when his disciples are springing to his defence, trying to beat away the people that are arresting him with their swords, Jesus is healing the very people that are arresting him. When they nail him to a cross after a mockery of trial, stark naked in agony, Jesus doesn't swear and curse as the other criminals would have done, but he forgives the people who are putting him on the cross. He doesn't just say you should love your enemies, he does it to the point of death. He's utterly consistent. And what I see again and again in Jesus' life, his attitude, his actions and his teaching is someone who is so different to what we so often see in religious violence and conflicts. And so my question is, if that is what Jesus is like, and if Jesus is the heart of the whole thing, what is the answer? To be less consistent or more to the Jesus we claim to follow? See, so many people say, well, it's okay to be religious, it's okay to be a Christian, but can't hold it lightly. Don't get too fundamentalist about it. But I'm saying, if this is what Jesus is like, the answer is not to hold it more lightly, but to hold it more firmly. It's very interesting, if you look back historically, at the time of William Wilberforce, there were many Christians, sadly, at the time, who supported slavery. Now, what was William Wilberforce's response to them? Was it to say, guys, you're taking Christianity too seriously. Loosen your Christian values and beliefs, and then we will get rid of slavery? No, it was the opposite. He said, guys, you're not taking the Bible seriously enough. If you really claim to follow Jesus, how could you do this? Or think of someone like Martin Luther King. Again, there were Christians in America that would have stood for racism. He didn't say, get rid of your Christianity and then we'll get rid of racism. He says, no, we need to take it more seriously. The answer is to follow Jesus more closely, not less. Be more consistent, not less, if this is what Jesus is really like. Religion may cause violence, philosophies may cause violence, but consistently following the Jesus of the Bible and the Jesus of history, I don't think would. There wouldn't be any place for it. So I guess it leaves us with a question just before we finish. What is the roots of all evil in that case? Where does evil and conflict come from, if it's not necessarily just from religion? Well, let me try and explain. I was in Burger King a while back. No, not that the root of all evil comes from Burger King, although maybe you agree. But I was in Burger King a while back. Sorry if you're at the Carol service, you heard this. But I was looking at the tray on which I was eating my bacon double. And this is what it says on the tray. It said, have it your way. You have the right to have exactly what you want, exactly when you want it. Because on the menu of life, you are today's special, and tomorrow's, and the day after that. Well, you get the drift. That's right. We may be the king, but you, my friend, are the almighty ruler. Now, what do you think of that? I almost choked on my bacon. I was thinking, that is a brilliant definition of what Christians often call sin. You see, it's basically the attitude that says, have it your way. And interestingly, Jesus said that's the problem, not just with religion, but the problem with all our hearts. We all want to have it our way. In fact, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus says it's from within, from out of a person's heart, that evil comes. He says the problem of the world is not the problem of religion, but the problem of the human heart, that all of us want it our way. All of us want to put ourselves at the centre. And what's the problem? What's the problem of living our way? Well, the problem is when I meet someone else who's trying to live their way, how do we sort it out when our paths cross and our ideas conflict? We find it out, maybe not with guns, I don't have any, but with words. Oh yeah, my relationships can be the cause and the centre of lots of conflicts. And maybe yours can too. Jesus says the heart is the problem. And the heart needs to be dealt with. And that's why Jesus actually came. Not to tack on another religion to the list of world religions. Not to tack on a load of rules to my life. But to bring the transformation of the human heart. That if we know and really know and follow Jesus Christ, that our hearts are changed by him. And that does change our lives. And it does change the way we see God and others as well. Jesus came to deal with the rubbish, the selfishness and the self-centeredness. Through his death, he didn't kill his enemies, but he died for them. To take all that rubbish so that we can be forgiven, changed, transformed, and made new. And the wonderful hope as well that the Bible gives is that there will be a day when conflict and violence will be over. In the Old Testament, in a book called Isaiah, Prophecy, we have this wonderful and beautiful, although slightly archaic, picture of what the world will one day be like. It's talking about the one who is to come, Jesus, and it said, he will judge between the nations and will settle disputes of many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. It's a beautiful picture of a day when violence and conflict, self-centeredness is ended. A day when peace really reigns. And that's what Jesus came to bring, real peace. Now, in our hearts, increasingly in our relationships, and ultimately one day in this world too, because of what he's done. So don't reject Jesus in the face of violence and religion. He is the one that really has an answer and a solution to it. No, I don't know where you're at. Maybe you're sitting here today and you're thinking, well, I don't buy it, mate. I don't agree. Okay? Well, you're valid, you're entitled to that opinion, okay? Can I just say though, if that is your opinion, I really would encourage you to check out The Real Thing. You know, we haven't got it on CD, but we have got it in a book. And this little book called Uncover is a copy of Luke's account of Jesus' life. It's one of the most reliable places to go because Luke, as well as being a medical doctor, was also a historian. There are many good reasons for accepting this as a historical, reliable source when it comes to the life of Jesus. why not check it and say, okay, if Christianity is about Jesus, I mean, the clue is in the word, it's Christianity, okay? And if it's about Jesus Christ, let's check it out. Let's see who Jesus is. Let's see what my experience of Christianity around the world, on media, maybe my friends, matches up to the person that they claim to follow. And look into it. You know, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, the worst thing that happens, it will take a couple of hours to read, okay? But then again, I'm sure we've never wasted 2 hours of our lives before, have we? Might take a couple of hours to read, and you'll at least walk away as an informed atheist, even if you still decide to reject it all and say it's rubbish, okay? You'll know what you've rejected. But of course you might not. You may say, actually, I didn't know what I'd rejected, and this is actually quite different. And you should investigate, okay? So take that away. It's free, it's our gift to you. And we think you'll find it helpful. But the other thing is to say, maybe there are some of you here and you're not cynical about this, perhaps you're curious about this. You would love to investigate Jesus, you would love to see what this looks like. What is the difference that Jesus makes? What would that look like for my life? Well, for you, the good news is that as well as this whole week of events that you're welcome to come to, after this week is finished, we've got a course called Uncover. Same name as the book, goes with the book. And it's just over 6 weeks, meeting together, looking at some of these accounts of the life of Jesus, bringing your questions, discussing it together. No need to be religious, no need to sing or pray or anything like that, but just investigate. Get your noses into the evidence, bring your questions and your doubts, and look into it. It's going to be really helpful. There are thousands of people, actually all over Europe now, that have been doing that course. Found it incredibly helpful in their investigation, and I'm sure you would. Okay. So, in literally 1 minute, we're going to go for questions. While we're having the questions, do fill out those little feedback forms that are on your chairs or tables, and everyone can leave some comments. You can say what you thought, you know, nice food, great crisps, rubbish speaker, whatever, yeah. You can be completely honest and put that on the feedback form. But if you would like to know about that course called Uncover, then tick the box that says tell me more. And if you tick the box, then leave your name and your number, and someone will get back in touch with you in 24 hours, and they'll let you know about the course. So just fill that in, there'll be someone at the door with a box, and they will take the cards off you. We won't sell your details to anyone else, we'll just let you know about the course. Okay? So fill those out while we have the questions, and then you'll be ready to hand them in at the end. But we've got 7 or 8 minutes, so we've got some time for questions. Now, have we had any on the text?
Yep.
We have. So we'll go straight for the text questions to start with then. Are you ready to read them out? Do you want to come up here and then you can read them to the microphone?
The first question we got, what about some parts of the Old Testament? Doesn't God say violence is okay there?
Great. Thank you so much for asking that question. I deliberately didn't deal with that in the talk because I assumed almost positively that someone would ask that question, so thank you. You've asked the question that probably everyone else was thinking. Okay? What about the violence in the Old Testament? What do we make of that? Well, we can't get away from the fact it's there. If you read the book of Exodus, you'll see how God takes the nation of Israel, a people from slavery in Egypt, takes them to the promised land, the land of Canaan, and in the process obviously drives out a lot of people who are already living in Canaan. And so a lot of people look at that and say, well, is this not ethnic cleansing of the most terrible kind? What is going on? Now, it's not easy, and lots of Christians that really grapple with this, because they're not easy passages to look at. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is there's no kind of easy one-word answer, so sorry, it will take me a couple of minutes, so just bear with me on this one, okay? But what do we make of the violence in the Old Testament? I think it's worth saying, firstly, what we see happening in the Old Testament, well, not everything that is described in the Old Testament is necessarily prescribed. Some of the violence that we see in the Old Testament isn't advocated by God, okay? Some of the wars Israel went on, God actually said you shouldn't have done that. They were peaceful and suspecting people, and actually that was wrong. You will face the consequences yourself for what you've done. Okay? So because the Bible is descriptive doesn't mean it's necessarily prescriptive. But that's not carrying the case for everything. There are certain things that are, it seems, prescriptive as well. Well, the other thing to say is that the wars and conflicts we see are not to be regarded as ethnic cleansing as we would see today, because actually what was going on is God was saying, I am judging certain nations, but not others, for the evil practices that have grown up and become commonplace in those countries. And if you were to do a study, I could take you to the British Museum, there's evidence for some of those practices, child sacrifice common among many of the Canaanite religions and such like. And this has become so common, God has said, actually, if you don't turn from this practice, there will be a day of judgment. And so what was happening was not ethnic cleansing, but actually God judging people for their continual rejection of him and their abuse of other people as well. And it wasn't that God just kind of clicked his fingers and said, okay, I've lost it with you guys. Actually, there's a patient period, for 400 years in fact we're told, where God is warning these people, saying if you don't repent, if you don't turn back to me, there will be consequences. And there are instances where people do turn back to God, they do repent, and they are spared the consequences. So it's not that this is going to happen no matter what. Actually, God does relent in those situations. It's also worth saying that God wasn't just kind of saying, I've got my favourites, they're Israel, and it doesn't matter what they do. Actually, God took seriously the evil that started to grow within the nation of Israel as well. So if you keep on reading through the Old Testament, you'll read that when God's people, Israel, started to adopt those practices themselves, they too faced exile and judgment from first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. They weren't exempt from it. But it's also worth saying, all of that comes in the rubric of the Old Testament. There's no reason today to say that God's people, whether they're in America or Britain, are the nation of Israel like they were. We have no mandate to go to war like they did. That doesn't mean that God doesn't take evil seriously. He does. And there will be an ultimate day of justice where evil will be brought to account for. But the good news is Jesus says, I am willing to take that justice that we all deserve through my death on the cross. And so our model is Jesus and we follow him. So there's a whole load of things that you probably want to bear in mind. I think one of the other things to say is don't read back into kind of 3,000-year-old history, kind of our contemporary worlds. Maybe the best way to say is, when we say, well, why didn't they just go in and kind of sit down and have some negotiations with these nasty Canaanites and say we can live together? I mean, you don't negotiate with the Taliban. And we see in Afghanistan some of the problems of trying to deal with the people who are bent on destroying others no matter what. How do you handle that? Now, when you think Canaanite religion and Old Testament nations, think more Taliban than, nice, unsuspecting, English people that you might hate because you're Scottish or whatever. It's more like that, okay? And that might help us too. So it's not a simple answer. There's various things you want to bear in mind. It might help us, okay? Might have time for one more. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That's all right. This one's quite long, so you might have to read it a couple of times. How can one measure how well one's interpolation of Christianity's concepts to areas that the Bible does not deal with corresponds to the correct one? So, have you got just that?
I'll paraphrase it, and if I've got it wrong, then please tell me that I've got it wrong. Am I saying that, how do we know that the good representatives that I've spoken about got it right, and the bad representatives got it wrong? How do we know that their understanding of the Bible was better than the other people's? If I'm wrong, disagree with me. Okay, I'll answer that question then. If it wasn't the question, I'm sorry. It's a good question. Christians have often disagreed on some interpretations of the Bible. That's no secret, and if you're going to become a Christian, that's probably worth knowing. But that doesn't mean that Christians disagree on everything in the Bible. There are some things in the Bible that are quite clear and more obvious. And so just because there are areas that are ambiguous, I would say there are other areas that I think are more obvious as well. And so when it comes to the Bible, it's not that you need a priest or a person with a PhD in theology to interpret it for you, to tell you what the correct interpretation and application is. We believe in the technical trade term is the perspicuity of the Bible. It means just the clearness of it. You can read it for yourself, okay? And you can make up your mind. So I would say do it. Read through the Gospel, look at the life of Jesus. If you think I've got it wrong, tell me. Okay? You can make up your own minds. I think it's fairly clear. And I think actually what was driving a lot of the bad representatives was not ultimately a wrong exposition of the Bible, that they had come to the wrong conclusion because they'd studied the text, but actually other motives, political and selfish and financial motives, that often were given the cloak of respectability in the name of religion. It wasn't the interpretation of Scripture that was driving it, it was actually other things, and then the other things were kind of used as a justification. I think if you were to sit down with the Bible, it's fairly clear on those kind of issues what it is to follow Jesus, if you're willing to read through it yourself. Right? One more quick, okay, we'll go really quick.
Yeah, this is really quick. Oh, it's gone away. Sorry, this isn't my phone. There it is. Is the God of the Bible more self-evident than the God of the Quran, and if so, is the reason empirical?
Is the God of the Bible more self-evident than the God of the Quran? I would say yes, because the God of the Bible is a God who's claimed to reveal himself in person, in history, not just through a book. So a Muslim would claim that God revealed himself through a prophet, Muhammad, and a book, the Quran. Christianity says that God revealed himself in Jesus, and that we can learn about him through historical texts, many of them in the Bible, but actually we don't worship a book, we worship a person, we worship Jesus. And that we can know that Jesus was who he claimed to be, not just because of his claims, but also because of his actions. And in particular, the claim of the resurrection, which is never claimed for any other religious leader, that Jesus is the one who has conquered death. Now, I have got no time to deal with that, but we will deal with it on Friday evening. So come back Friday evening, we'll look at the biggest and the most objective evidence for Christianity and Jesus in the resurrection. So it'll be great to see you there. Tonight you can come along, and I'm going to be speaking on success. How much is enough, and does it really satisfy? And there'll also be some other things as well. And we'll hand back. Thank you.